Haven't been on camera in a while, feeling a little bit ghostly. If it isn't us here in 2022. Welcome back to the channel. I'm moving on from this intro, I release it. If the universe wanted me to do a better job with it, it should have helped me out. Me and Tanner were supposed to film yesterday for the first time in a few weeks. We were very excited, but Tanner has had kind of a mini COVID scare at his house. We don't think anyone has COVID, but we're not sure. Anyway, we just decided it would be best this week to skip filming, which is a bummer because our revenue is down. And it's not about the money, but it's a little bit about the money, you know? Support us on Patreon. Anyway, I have been wanting to do this video anyway, so I thought perfect timing. I wanted to go over the books I read in 2021 that I found the most life-changing. You can follow me on Goodreads if you want to see all the books I read in 2021. But these are just the ones that I felt were worth talking about, especially to... I'm gonna try not to kick my chair a lot because it makes a very loud clanging sound. These are the books that I also felt were most relevant to ex-Mormons, or really anyone going through a life transition, or coming out of a different religion, or a relationship, or anything like that. I read a lot of non-fiction self-help books. Oh God, the sirens. They are relentless. All right, so let's kick it off with the first book I read in 2021, I think, which was Untamed by Glennon Doyle. I don't have my copy of this with me because I lent it to my boyfriend's mum, who, fun fact, is Mormon and one of the most beautiful people in the world. She's reading it right now. I'm late to the party on this one because I feel like Glennon Doyle has had a cult following for a long time. I didn't know really anything about her before I read this book, but basically she is a Christian writer who has in the past written various memoirs about her life as a Christian woman. She's always kind of erred, it seems, on the side of being more progressive than her community or like the version of Christianity she's been a part of. But this book, Untamed, kind of details her story, realizing she was gay in a marriage to a man. And essentially the whole message of the book is like her coming into her power, learning to trust herself, learning how to live authentically, knowing how to trust her gut instincts. You know, it can be kind of difficult when you've grown up with certain religious ideas to know what's a gut instinct or what's like healthy intuition and what is, you know, scrupulosity. So she discusses a lot of themes like that. It's essentially a book about female empowerment, though my boyfriend listened to it on Audible and loved it, so I don't think it's just for women. I'll share one little story from the book that I found compelling right off the bat. So she's a mum. She has both, I think maybe one boy, and I don't remember how many kids she has, but basically she has both male and female kids. And she was once hosting this sleepover where her son and his friends were there, and her daughter and her friends were there. And she goes into the room, they're all watching a movie together, and she's like, hey, do any of you want something to eat? Like I could make pizza bites or whatever. And all of the boys instantly, without looking away from the screen, were like, yes. And then all of the girls looked at each other to determine whether they wanted to eat, which was so familiar to me. And I feel like a lot of women watching this will be able to relate to that. But she tells this story as an example of how girls growing up are not taught to trust themselves and their bodies and what they need in the way that men are. And I think food is just one example of that. Like how many of us have suffered with tough relationships with food because, you know, you're not sure what you are allowed or deserve, or it's a whole mess, right? So she writes this really beautiful essay about how, you know, messed up it is that the girls all looked to each other to determine if they themselves were hungry, and then they all collectively decided that no, they weren't hungry, which also felt familiar. So this book is beautifully written. She is a very poetic writer. It's very it's a lot of sort of like Zen and just sort of contemplative philosophy and mindfulness, but put into such a fun, accessible read. So if you haven't read Glennon Doyle, I feel like a lot of you will have, but if you haven't read her book Untamed, highly recommend. Let's move on. Okay, so the next book that I really loved is The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. And this, if you're familiar with Eckhart Tolle, it's very similar to that. If you're familiar with anything, again, related to Zen or Buddhism, mindfulness, if you're a meditator, then a lot of the concepts will be very familiar. It's basically about going beyond this kind of conceptual identity we have of ourselves, you know, I am X, Y, Z, whatever we are, and really moving into a more expansive view of ourselves as inseparably connected to the whole, and, you know, capable of harnessing more power than we realize through being present and not always getting lost and wasting mental resources by overthinking. Lots of stuff like that. If that sounds really woo-woo to you, maybe you wouldn't like it. But it's such a sensible explanation of what I consider to be like the truest spiritual principles, or the ones that every spiritual teacher throughout history that is worth anything has taught. So yeah, very Buddhist, very Zen. It's definitely great if you struggle with kind of navigating your emotions, like you have a lot of intense emotions. You often go into spirals, you maybe struggle with relationships because you have a lot of hurt and trauma, and you find it difficult to sort of navigate life, I suppose. I mean, don't we all, right? We all struggle to navigate life in certain ways because we all are capable of hurting and have past hurts that affect how we see things now, all that kind of stuff. It's basically just a really good guide to having a spiritual awakening, may I be so bold as to say. So really, really recommend. As I said, very similar to sort of Eckhart Tolle, but I really liked this format, even though it was sort of similar information as Eckhart Tolle and a lot of other people I've read. I still found it very compelling and interesting, and I find that when I read books like this, it just as I'm reading them, you know, let's say I'm reading them over the course of 2 weeks or whatever, it's like in that time I just naturally am more mindful in my life. So I really like to kind of have a mindful book on the go a lot of the time, because I feel like it just helps me when I'm getting a regular dose of the right kind of ideas, what I consider to be the right kind of ideas about sort of Zen and mindfulness. It helps me out a lot. So that's my second recommendation. Okay, third book I want to talk about. I have to give some disclaimers because I feel like a lot of you might be similar to me. So I read this book, Dopamine Nation. And after, I think the third chapter, I nearly quit, and I was kind of annoyed at the author, who is this woman, Anna Lemke. She has a PhD. She's a dopamine researcher, basically. So this is a book that discusses dopamine, you know, the chemical that is released in our brain when we are in the pursuit of pleasure or experience pleasure, the thing that goes off when in your brain when you're scrolling on your phone or you eat or you need to find food, whatever. You guys know what dopamine is, I assume. So what I loved about this book is she talks essentially about all the research she's done about dopamine. It's a pretty good introductory guide to dopamine and to how we are so led by dopamine. Like dopamine is what motivates us to find food or really pursue anything that we believe will have a reward, whether it's like completing a task at work or just anything we do in life that is sort of related to dopamine. And when we have low motivation, we usually have got low dopamine. So she writes a lot about how, dopamine is it's a system that works always wanting to get back to equilibrium. I'm going to hate myself editing this because I'm going to be like, Sam, you sound like an idiot. Take a science class. But basically, what goes up must come down with dopamine. So an example of this, let's use a more extreme example, is if you take a hard drug like, I don't know, Molly, then you're going to get a massive spike of dopamine, but you're going to probably feel it the next day and feel quite depressed and low because your dopamine is spiked so much, you're going to experience a crash. So one of the things I really loved in the book is she writes about how we can take advantage of this equilibrium situation and use pain to our advantage. Because if we're only ever seeking dopamine through sort of like pleasurable things, then we're just getting a lot of that like up and crash. But she talked about how like micro stressors, like taking a cold shower, for example, can ultimately be really great ways to get dopamine. And a lot of us don't think about, boosting our feelings of happiness and pleasure and motivation necessarily through painful things. I mean, I guess we sort of do because a lot of people are aware that working out can boost your happy hormones. It's basically that principle. Anyway, so I found that all really interesting. Lots of very fascinating stuff in this book. This book definitely helped me feel more equipped to navigate the world and the many vices and pleasures it offers us. But my disclaimer I want to give is the reason I was originally annoyed with it is because she does dopamine research for a living, she's pretty anti cannabis and psychedelic drugs. She doesn't come out and say she's anti them, but she makes a good point. Like, for example, if you smoke weed every day, then, because she talks about a teenage client she had who was smoking weed every day and having tons of anxiety, and when she got this client off weed, her anxiety went away. And she talks about why that can happen. It's because weed can provide a dopamine spike when people smoke it. So if you get used to always spiking your dopamine with it, then you're gonna kind of be on more of a roller coaster than you would be otherwise. So she's all about like finding balance. I mean, the subtitle of the book is Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. So I get where she's coming from with the way that she talks about certain drugs that I would consider to be also beneficial to lots of people. But I'm glad I stuck it out. As I said, I nearly quit 3 chapters in because I was like, oh, she's just demonizing, things that I do believe are valuable plant medicines. But overall, I learned more than I was frustrated. And it's not necessarily her job to talk about the benefits of cannabis and psychedelic drugs in a book about dopamine, so it's fair enough. But just wanted to give that disclaimer going in, if you can stomach that, all you potheads. Okay, next book. This is my boyfriend's, so I don't have a copy of it. It's called My Policeman, and it's a fiction book. It's stunning, it's perfect, it's brilliant. It's set, I believe, in the 50s in Brighton in England, which I loved. And it's essentially a story of 2 gay men, and one of whom is married to a woman throughout their life. And it's like gripping and heartbreaking. And I feel like whenever I hear that a book's going to be heartbreaking, I don't want to read it. But this is the kind of book where, though it's heartbreaking, it's so satisfying to read because it's so good. I don't really have anything else to say about it. It's just really good, and I think you should all read it if you're looking for a gay fiction story. Brilliant. It really transports you into what it has been like, and obviously still is, for gay people throughout history, and how, love is the thing that makes life worth living for most of us. And just the fact that gay people have been denied that in all these ways. It's just, it's a really powerful book. I highly recommend it. Okay, next book. I feel like a lot of people follow the Holistic Psychologist on Instagram, so this probably isn't unfamiliar to a lot of you. It's How to Do the Work by Dr. Nicole LaPera. She is a psychologist, and she has a holistic way of looking at mental health. Like, one of the reasons I really like her is she doesn't subscribe to pretty debunked theories about like the serotonin myth, for example, which is kind of the myth driving widespread antidepressant use, which is this idea that people with depression just don't produce enough serotonin. If we can just give them an SSRI, then they'll get better. Obviously, mental health, we now know, is much more complex than that, and there's I think 11 main factors that researchers have identified that can cause depression, for example, and serotonin is like barely on the map as a major one. Like, most of us have experienced childhood trauma to varying degrees, and that plays like the largest role in our mental health struggles. Maybe this doesn't need to be said, but just so we're clear, I'm not against antidepressant use or what anyone chooses to do to navigate their own mental health. And obviously antidepressants do work for certain people, and I value that, and just wanted to make sure there wasn't any confusion about my stance. I have no hard stances on anything, okay? In addition to things like nutrition and movement and sunlight, like these are things that I see sometimes being condemned on Twitter, for example, like the idea that you could just exercise and that will help your depression. And I understand the mindset behind that. Like, you can't tell everyone with depression, like, go for a run and you'll feel better. Obviously it's not going to work like that. But incorporating movement into your life in whatever ways you can, based on your ability to do so, is an important part of good mental health, kind of whoever you are. And I remember when I first went to a therapist years ago for depression, the first thing he recommended was doing cardio every day. Anyway, I'm not trying to get into all the specific theories, but this is just a really good outline of how to do the work. Like, if you're coming out of religion, or you're just in a place in your life where you're like, I've been through some stuff, and I'm showing up in the world in ways that don't necessarily feel good, or I have ideas about myself that I don't necessarily like. I feel like my relationship with myself is maybe not the best, whatever it is, whatever kind of healing self-exploration journey you're wanting to go on, I think this is a great book. It's just a great comprehensive guide, and everything in it is like stuff I already knew and have found is the ticket for healing, at least for me personally. Like, everything doesn't work for everyone, obviously. But yeah, reading this was like, oh yes, it's so nice when you see someone who's a professional lay out what you have learned through experience works. So, really good book. Highly recommend. It's cheaper than therapy. Not that it's a substitution, but not everyone can afford therapy. And for me personally, I've found reading advice from therapists more helpful than actual therapy. I don't know if I'm in the minority there. I just think different things work for different people. Yeah, that's it. Stop talking about that one now. I'm not done. I'm giving another disclaimer. Sometimes when I post about the holistic psychologist on Instagram, people will message me saying, oh, you know that she's been in this controversy. And I have looked into those controversies. And while I see both sides, like, I ultimately have not found any reason to not love what the holistic psychologist is doing. I understand that her work doesn't resonate with everyone, but I found most of the negative claims made about her, when I say most, I do mean all, I'm just being honest, I don't find them compelling. Maybe there's more stuff I haven't seen. I tried to take the deepest dive I could into various people's story highlights that different people told me to watch that encapsulated the whole thing. But yeah, bottom line, I didn't agree with the criticism that people had of her. Okay, next book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. This book is written by Clarissa Pinkola Este, PhD. The author, I believe, comes from... Does she come from Native American lineage? I think she does. But basically in this book, she outlines these myths and stories of the wild woman archetype. So she talks about all these myths and stories that cultures throughout history, including the one that she comes from, the stories that have been told to teach us something. Humans are obviously storytelling creatures, and we really resonate with stories, and throughout history we've used stories a lot to gain wisdom and to instill wisdom in younger people, because I think our brains are just naturally wired to learn through stories and to process the world through stories, so it's really helpful. But this is just such an interesting book. It's a book of female empowerment again, and it is a really spiritual book, in my opinion. It's got so much good stuff in there about, again, as I said with Untamed, learning to trust your intuition. She talks a lot about the importance of women, while it's a massive strength for us to be so often so soft and so giving and trusting, it's also really important to not be naive. And so there's a lot of cool stuff in there about maturing beyond kind of girlhood naivety into this powerful womanhood that also honors and invites the inner child to come to play. It's very poetic, and it's quite it's almost like, my friend once described Untamed, the first book I recommended, as the Cosmo version of this, and I would agree with that assessment. It's a really beautiful book. I learned a lot about myself through it. When you just read a book and it's prompting so much good inner exploration and it's making you feel inspired and empowered. I love that feeling. Again, I love having a book like that on the go, because I just feel like it comes into every area of my life as I'm reading it, and you've always got sort of some good thought to be marinating on, which just seems to enhance everything. Have I said enough about that book? I don't know. I'm moving on. The final book that I want to talk about, that I really hope a lot of you read, is called The Course of Love by Alain de Botton, I think is how you pronounce it. And this is essentially a typical sort of love story, as in it's a story of two people who are very normal. It's set in England, which I also love. I always love when a book is set in my home country. But it's just the story of a normal couple getting together, and then it has commentary kind of in between, these relationship milestones that they're going through. That is incredibly insightful. Like, it will describe what's happening behind the scenes when people get together, and it's all so relatable. The way that it describes the beginning period of a relationship, and then the potential disillusionment that a lot of people feel when they have committed their lives to each other and realize, like, oh shit, this isn't as magical as it once was. Like, it describes relationships in such a real and insightful way that is so refreshing. I feel like anyone who's interested in long-term partnership should read this book, because it's just so insightful. And it really hits home how normal a lot of things are that maybe we would be inclined to believe are dysfunctions unique to us. So really beautiful. My boyfriend read it before me. We both were obsessed with it. It's exactly our sort of view on relationships. The way that the author speaks about relationships is how we both feel too. And it's also really, it describes like relationships in such a rose-tinted glasses off kind of way, but in a way that still makes you believe in them more than ever. It's like he's removing the rose-tinted glasses that a lot of us were taught to wear with relationships and replacing it with a more real glass lens that is somehow more beautiful, even though like you have to go through a disillusionment to take off the rose-tinted glasses and get to that. But so he's essentially scrapping these fairy tale ideas about love, but then replacing it with something that is both more real and more beautiful, in my opinion. Anyway, has anyone else read this? I'd never heard of it before my boyfriend was reading it. So those are all my books that I have to recommend from 2021. I did read other good stuff too. Oh, and I did want to give an honourable mention to a writer I really loved last year called Matt Haig, who is a British writer, and I read 3 of his books last year: How to Stop Time, The Humans, and The Midnight Library. They're all fiction, and they're all just really beautiful. He's very insightful. He knows I just deleted the note in my phone with all of this on it. He writes about humans in such a like fresh, fun, insightful way. This video is just me saying insightful over and over again. I'm sorry. I haven't made a video in a while, so I feel a little bit rusty. I hope I gave you some inspiration for what you might read in 2021. Let me know if you've read any of these or plan to, and please let me know what you read in 2021 that you found the most life-changing, because I always need suggestions. I burn through books and I want to read them all. I want to read all the good ones. There's too many books in the world. As always, I hope you're doing well, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon, where you'll get bonus content. Me and Tana are reading the sequel to Charlie right now. It's called Sam. We haven't filmed an episode in a few weeks because of Christmas holidays, but we should be filming one soon, and that's been fun. So yeah, join us there. By the way, behind me is my Peter Rabbit calendar, which I'm using as my dry January tracker. I'm doing dry January. Follow me on my personal Instagram if you want to get updates about that. It's actually been really cool so far. I'll probably do a video on it.